The City Press newspaper reporting today that suspended NSFAS CEO Andile Nongogo believes his suspension is linked to lucrative offtake agreements. He claims the companies basically handpicked by a senior government official and the scheme's board chairperson, Ernest Khosa. Nongogo was suspended in August over a conflict of interest in the appointment of payment providers. He's now been given until tomorrow, that's Monday, to justify why his contract should not be terminated by the scheme. Let's get the view now of Professor Alex van den Heever, governance expert with the Wits School of Governance. Let's talk about what we're hearing today, Prof, from the City Press. If anything, what this article then confirms is that the rotted, the National Financial Aid Scheme, Student Financial Aid Scheme, runs much deeper than many would have imagined.
Yes, firstly, the procurement of service providers would be operationally run by the Chief Executive Officer. But the board is clearly responsible for the procurement policy and ensuring adherence to the procurement policy, and for contracts of this nature, final approval, which requires all details of the contracts and the procurement process to be made available to the board, both through board committees and ultimately to the board. It is impossible, in my mind, to accept that this procurement arrangement occurred and was only within the knowledge of the chief executive. So it does look as though a large number of people are involved, and this unfortunately is the kind of problem we're seeing where we have boards appointed by ministers. They're political appointments, and they're not necessarily the correct people or the people who are actually going to hold an organisation to account. And this is an organisation that spends 50 billion rand a year.
And City Press says it's seen a list which Nongogo says supports his allegation that Ernest Khosa, the board chair, basically influenced the appointment of companies which would benefit from a 20-year lease for the accommodation of students. If that is true, what is alarming, or one of the questions it raises for me, Prof, is whether we'd even know this if Nongogo had himself not been found out to have been involved in the payment system and the companies there. So is this a declaration of public interest? Is he doing it because he wants better for NSFAS, or simply to get back at Khosa, who himself, by Nongogo's allegations, is benefiting some way or influencing processes within the scheme?
Well, what's unclear about the comment from the chief executive is exactly how a chairperson acting on their own is able to influence any of these decisions. The chairperson is merely a convener of the board and will hold, in most cases, a final vote, a determining vote for any decision made by the board. But the chairperson has no authority to interfere in operational decisions on their own. So there is no direct influence that a chair can actually exercise over a chief executive. The chief executive is responsible for the day-to-day administration of any organisation, and the board is the body that has all the powers. So the chair shouldn't. What is essentially looks as though he's disclosing, is that there is an individual set of relationships where people are essentially colluding on matters, but they're doing so in their personal capacities. But it is impossible for this kind of arrangement, and from the information that was made available in the public on the Werksman's analysis of the tender process, the chief executive was also directly involved in the procurement process, which he should not be.
Right.
And a procurement policy should be formed by the board and adhered to by the letter. There should be no deviation, and any deviation would have to be explained to the board, not just to the chairperson in his personal capacity. So all of this looks extremely fishy, and it looks like there were a lot of hands in this pot.
And he says, just on the point of a lot of hands in this pot, Nongogo, in the piece on the City Press front page today, says this: the decisions regarding the direct payments were taken in full alignment with the minister, chairperson and board. He says they were part of the step-by-step process, were fully informed and provided inputs right up until the execution of the tender process. He says the chairperson was fully involved and informed in the day-to-day running of operations of NSFAS, including the direct payments. And then he says, my case is a classic one of being made the proverbial scapegoat at the altar of political expediency.
So the question is whether they were involved in colluding on deviating from procurement policy, because there's no procurement policy that would permit the chief executive to be involved in a bid evaluation committee and to interfere in the criteria involved in a tender process. That process should be handled independently and should be separately evaluated and approved, and then the board should be approving that separately. So there's no alignment possible where people have agreed to a deviation from procurement rules. That in itself is wholly improper, and the board, obviously, if they did it, should be fired, all of them. So the other issue is that if that did happen and there was the so-called alignment, it would all be in board minutes, financial committee minutes, their bid evaluation committee minutes and notes, and signatures on all sorts of approval documents that would be required for a contract of this nature. So there would be a massive paper trail. So the idea that somehow there's alignment, which is all verbal, I mean, I don't know if that's what the implication is, but if there's alignment, there will be evidence, and there'll be evidence in documentation right up to board approval. So obviously this board has a lot to answer for. But I don't think that in any way this exonerates the chief executive, who cannot be a party to deviation from procurement policy. That in itself is massively irregular.
It comes back
and
point,
invalidates all tenders and contracts.
It comes back to my point, the question perhaps slightly poorly phrased earlier, where I was saying you have to wonder if he'd even be telling us this if he wasn't, as he claims now, the proverbial scapegoat. Are you acting in the interest of the country, or are you basically getting back, as he claims, at people who you thought were batting on the same team but have now done you dirty, essentially?
Yeah, so it tends to look like the latter, that this is he's turning on the others. It looks like it looks very fishy, the overall arrangement, and if there was an informal agreement on the deviation from policy, he is now clearly being fingered, and feels, improperly that this is unfair because somehow all the other culprits aren't being held equally accountable. The reality is they all should be held accountable. And definitely there is a lot for the board to answer. That's even without this disclosure from the chief executive. Because to me it is impossible for such a fishy deal to have gone through without the board having been completely aware of it at the end of the day. It should have been disclosed in all board minutes, all notices, in all discussions for the final approval of this procurement deal. So there's no way that the board can have been ignorant of what was going on. They would also not been ignorant of the deviations, because you have to explain deviations from the procurement policy, because that by definition will make it an irregular contract, which would have its own implications. So so none of them come out of this, and I don't believe that he is singularly the scapegoat. They are all the culprits potentially, and essentially all of them have to explain exactly what the hell happened here, and quite possibly a number of people should go to jail. And
Professor, there's that issue, right, where Nongongo now, there's been a finding against him by Werksmans and Advocate Tembe Toby. That's to do, yes, with the payment system, which was quite chaotic, in fact, of tertiary students. Now today in the City Press, he claims, he's making this claim related to a 20-year lease for the accommodation of students. Claims a list of company was sent to him. He was put under pressure, allegedly by the board chair, Ernest Khosa, to basically ensure that these companies got this lease contract. He then also says this to the City Press, that just yesterday, a day before he spoke to the paper, that he became aware that days after his suspension, his electronic signature was used without his permission to issue student accommodation offtake agreements. These are 12 agreements, letters that is, which were sent to potential service providers. If that is true, sounds like a clear-cut case of fraud. How damning would it be for the chairperson if indeed he's involved in this?
Well, obviously it would be extremely damning. It is quite clearly fraud. The question is whether there was a fraudulent use of his signature, because there's a paper trail. The use of electronic media to sign will typically be associated with all of the sort of concurrent emails that went with the electronic approval process. But again, it comes down to this issue of the influence of a chairperson. And this, to me, is the thing that I don't understand, because a chair on their own has no power or authority. They have no authority over anybody. They cannot influence any specific decision. And the moment they start to talk to an organization or any part of an organization to authorize a deal, they are acting in their personal capacity and improperly. So there's no direct influence other than the influence that they can exercise through the board. There's the possibility that a chair can exercise political influence through having a relationship with the member of the executive and the ANC, for instance, and a political party. If that is the influence they're exercising, then we're looking right at the way and the manner in which the board itself was appointed and who was made chair. Because if they were appointed in order to be able to manipulate this organization that can allocate lucrative contracts, then that is highly problematic and goes to the gap in a large number of our public organizations.
Should the board be dissolved?
I think the board is in trouble. Yes. I don't know. The nature of the board appointments includes people who would have been nominated, for instance, by the Minister of Finance. So there are officials potentially, or people that are appointed by other departments. It's unclear whether every single board member was actually implicated in this. So I would say that there needs to be an investigation of exactly what happened at board meetings. So the actual formal process of approving contracts needs to be examined in detail, and then the individuals held to account. Now, with the board, it doesn't matter who nominated you. You're not there in a representative capacity. You are then individually accountable. And I would say that there is a strong indication that the entire board is at fault unless the board process itself was manipulated and people were left out of decision making, and in just merely doing that invalidates the board decisions. So I think there's a lot to investigate here, because none of it makes sense within the context of normal corporate governance rules.
Professor Alex van den Heever, good to have your time, governance expert at the Wits School of Governance. Thank you very much for your time tonight.